So welcome everyone, and good evening to those of you joining in Europe. Good morning to anyone who is dialing in from West Coast. So today we are here to have to talk about tracking, talk about measuring, and to talk about reporting. This webinar is hosted by Tremo. For those of you who don't know us yet, we're an end-to-end trust and safety solution provider for online platforms of all sizes. We combine NEMA, our AI-powered trust and safety operations platform, to scale moderations, speed up investigations, and automate compliance, including transparency reporting. With our trust and safety advisory, and we have supported some of the largest platforms in the world to build solid operations and meet evolving regulations across EU DSA, UK OSA, and beyond. And today, we'll explore how trust and safety teams are evolving their data practices under new regulatory and public expectations. And to guide this, because this is a huge topic, this is really, we could go left, right, center, very deep, very narrow with it. So to guide us a little bit here, we're going to be talking about tracking. What data are we tracking? Why are we tracking it? What are we actually measuring with that data, and what matters to measure it? And what should we report, and to who, and what will make that reporting meaningful? I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves. Ladies first, Julie, would you like to go? We've lost Julie at the most inopportune cases. Aaron, sure. Would you like to go first then?
Hey, I'm Aaron Rodericks. I'm the head of Trust and Safety at Bluesky. I hope Julie resolves her internet issues. I've been here for about 2 years. Prior to this, I was at Twitter for about 5 years, ending up there as one of the co-leads of Trust and Safety as well.
Go ahead, Louis Victor.
Hi, I'm Louis Victor. I'm one of the co-founders of Tremo. Before launching Tremo exactly 4 years ago, worked in the French government on a number of regulatory and related texts as well. And as we wait for Julie, maybe Agna, you also want to introduce yourself, because you often forget to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so hi. I think Julie, so Louis Victor has been in a storm the whole day. And so I think Julie maybe caught up in that storm. Hopefully her internet is restored soon. But and I'll be moderating today. I'm Magna Carleb. I'm Managing Director of Advisory Services. And I help companies of all shapes and sizes with issues in trust and safety and regulations. My background is in government. My previous job was writing and negotiating the DSA, and I apologize to anyone who's been impacted by that. And we have Julie back.
That's the beauty of working in tech, is just when you're introducing people that my connection dropped, and it's because my son is playing video games, so I just had to shout a little bit and then come back.
Wonderful. Your turn to introduce yourself. We've all gone already around.
Sure. My name is Julie de Vaillancourt. I've been in the tech industry for 20 plus years. I've worked for Meta, for TikTok. I'm currently contracting for Google, and I've had a whole gambit of experience from ops, or user ops as it was known, to public policy, to more site integrity projects. So I have the chance to witness firsthand how TNS has grown and changed in the last few years.
Wonderful. Really glad to have you here. Really excited for this discussion. And I just want to start with the basics. And I would like to start with you, Julie. So what is actually worth tracking? So between internal dashboards, regulatory reporting, all sorts of reporting across all sorts of teams, there's no shortage of metrics really around, especially in large scale and high data environments, and some of which you have worked in. How central was data to the day-to-day work that you did, and how did you ensure that you were getting the right data? How did you decide on what was worth tracking? Design of user flows or internal operations? How did you get the metrics you needed? Could you highlight any challenges you had on the way or any notable examples?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the initial requirement for tracking data was purely based on ops efficiency. As platforms scaled, and if you gain users in any locale, or it's just informing decisions such as, are we managing incoming volumes the way we should? Do we need to hire more people? Do we have people speaking the right languages? Do we have gaps in our ability to respond to requests from users for support? So this kind of ops efficiency or ops excellence was the initial driver. At the time, platforms were not thinking, we should be transparent about what we're doing, because there wasn't really a push to do so. I think the second driver was being more user-centric, understanding that when people report something, or if they get the help that they need straight away, or provide more context, let's say on an abuse report, it's a win-win for everybody. It makes your teams more efficient. It provides better service for people who may be in need of help. So, for example, if you have a simple reporting flow for nudity and porn, being able to add, and by the way, this is me depicted on the photo or video, can make a difference to how you handle those type of reports, and how egregious something may be. And then the third push was regulation. Obviously, as platforms try to show that they were responsible, dedicated, proactive, there was a push to publish some data in transparency reports, and then came the arrival of OSA, DSA, and a plethora of other regulatory requirements that then force platform to provide this. So I think a few years ago, there may have been internal discussions on, should we even share this particular metric? Does it make sense for us to share how proactive we are, how fast we are at detecting certain types of abuse? Now, if you look at the spectrum of reports that are put out by platforms and the data that is required by regulators, I think pretty much everybody has a good understanding of those things. But the challenge remains to agree on what data should be tracked and why. How long should it be retained? What does it mean? Are definitions from the regulator aligned with what matters, right now within a given company? And how can you avoid tracking so many things that you drown in it, I guess? Just the opposite problem that Aaron would have at Blue Sky. But sometimes too much data is also a problem. You have so much of it that you don't know what it means. And it makes it difficult to express this in a way that makes sense for regulators, and to understand what users really want as well.
Thanks so much, Julie. This is super, super interesting. So I think what I heard was a lot of the driver was ops efficiency, user centricity. So looking at how to get better data from users, and also servicing users to understand them better, as well as regulatory pushes, and maybe initially probably trying to stave off regulation, right, with transparency or proactive transparency, and then regulatory push to actually publish. Aaron, how does this, you're building still from kind of 0 to 1 in Blue Sky, right? How do these priorities or drivers track with you? How are you designing now, right? With all of the experience and impact that you have, how are you designing to track the right data from day one?
I think the question just needs to be parameterized around how many resources we have, because I think when you're coming in with millions or billions of dollars in revenue, and you can throw a huge amount of people and resources at a problem, you can instrument your way into a measurement paradise, and be able to figure out exactly which to tweak to get what outcome. And that's often what you end up in an end state of. You have very mature systems, you turn the dial 3% this way, and you go, hey, engagement went up 1%. This is a successful experiment over 3 weeks. That's what I've seen at the larger companies. It operates the same way at a small company, except you're doing it blindfolded. Since you, it's kind of like swinging at a piñata. You know, they twirl you around a couple of times, and then you take a big swing, but you really don't know until you hit something in the sense. So I know it's an odd comparison. I'm coming with this up on the spot, but certainly when you're trying to build something, Bluesky was 20 people for the majority of last year, at least. We only just hit 30 people this year. We don't have the luxury of having, an army of data scientists. We don't even have a data scientist. So comparatively, it's just much harder to instrument things out. So what we've learned, instead of just building it and then going, hey, what do we measure? We now ask, what is the most important thing we are trying to achieve by this? And do we already have a proxy measure in place? Or can we instrument it in a way that allows us to figure out whether we're succeeding or not? Because the last thing we want to do is treat early stage companies as an art form as opposed to a science. And I think as maturity goes, you end up with more of the science, more of the, and I'm coming from a little bit more data-oriented background. So I certainly hyperventilated in the earlier days when, I'd see like, oh, it was a wild success. Well, how do you know? Well, it was obviously a wild success. Well, no, you don't, because you didn't have systems that told you that this happened. You were going off the vibes, and look, that's acceptable in the extreme early stage phase. But now we've hit the kind of element where if I'm working on toxicity, I know, hey, I'm getting this many user reports already on a daily basis. This many of them are focused on toxicity. So if I can reduce those by 30% or 50% off of this initiative, I'm having a positive impact on this proxy measure. So this is one way that, I'm always trying to distill down to go, if I'm working on this, what is it going to impact? And can we then have a measurable impact on that? And if not, go back to the drawing board and pick something else, but at least you're trying.
Super insightful. And actually, I have a quick follow-up question. Maybe that's a bit provocative, but if you had 3 metrics, right? So on your dashboards, what would they be? Like if you could.
I love how unfair the question is, where it's like, hey, Julie, like which 3 million dashboards do you need to get your job done? And then Aaron, hey, which 3? Just, say
10. Say 10.
Well, no, let's go with the 3. I just want to
10.
complain. That's my nature. There are French people on the call. I'm trying to blend in. But nevertheless, so I thought about this question a little bit, and there's 3 things that matter to me. And the first would be, what's my backlog looking like? We don't have an unlimited amount of moderators, and we got spikes all over the place, and I have no ability to predict that. So the 2 variables that I need is 1, what's the backlog looking like at any given time? And 2, what's the incoming spike rate? We can have an event and it suddenly goes sideways, and then all of a sudden we need to double the amount of moderators we throw at the problem. We need to bring in vendors to back us up. So those 2 numbers are probably the ones that I check the most compulsively out of all my dashboards. And then the controversial third one that I selected was not something from any of my dashboards, but it was our trending topics on the site, similar to what trends used to be on Twitter. But that to me is an indication when we have an event that is spiking globally on the site that could have some violent or negative content that we then need to moderate. So when we're having an emerging trend that is associated with a violent, extremist event, things like that, a graphic event, could be shooting, could be this, I know that, it's maybe get all hands on deck and start trying to move mods to mitigate the harms associated with that emerging trend.
Sorry, mute. Super interesting. I love that. Louis Victor, over to you. based on the platforms that you worked with, and you've looked at industries and sizes, what are the data points that are essential from your viewpoint for a robust trust and safety operation? And what are the most common requests you receive to build in terms of dashboards?
Thanks, Agnen. It's really interesting to piggyback and follow on what Aaron and Julie have been saying, because we spoke about a platform. We say 0 to 1, but I want to say 0 to 100 probably already, because you are growing super fast, and the growth and the user base is growing a lot. And Julie, some of your feedback, and especially on some of the needs around operation efficiency and how those data was really what was driving a lot of the systems. We at Tremor have worked with some very large, but also some of the starting companies, and helping them really set up what I'll call the infrastructure of trust and safety. What is that base layer, that base technology that you can use to really set up your systems and be able to scale your operations over time? And what we've seen is a bit to what Aaron, you were saying, is the importance of being able for them to be scalable, because of course you never know what can happen, right? You never know what crisis can hit you. You never know what influx can suddenly come suddenly, and you can have a new president that decides, or something that happens that decides that overnight, you have 5 million extra users coming to your platform. If the systems, if it hasn't been set up in the right way, then you are going to run into potentially issues. Or but the same thing with the flexibility, right? You can have a regulator that comes up with a new, that decides to have, every year decides to issue what will be the data points that will be required for its new transparency reporting. That will mean that if you haven't been able to track those data points, not knowing what they will be in the future, but if you don't have the system in place that would have preemptively tracked them, then you will be in trouble the moment of having to do those reports. So for me, what's really interesting is, and important, is how scalable, flexible, and compliant the infrastructure is at the very beginning. And then touching on some of the points that were mentioned, it's also interesting to see, as we speak with our customers and different personas, different roles within the company, how different people need very different types of data points, right? Some of the data points, Aaron, you were mentioning, is going to be very different from what we hear legal, or an AI engineer, or or the moderator himself, right? The moderator himself or herself, when they're doing work, they're also seeing some level of data, right? They're not seeing the dashboard, but they still need to have maybe some information around the user, some metadata around the content itself. What is that data that we can show, and how is that showed? And so that's, again, what's the flexibility that you can put in the infrastructure? We've seen this across many different use cases. One of them that I remember of when I was when we were discussing this panel was one of our clients. They had difficulty understanding. They had a problem with spam, and they had tried changing the thresholds, changing some of the rules, but it was really never really going away. And as they were using a new infrastructure, and as they were really looking to how to scale their operations, they also started realizing we could zoom in, and we can actually go in and deep dive into that specific use case, start investigating, and realizing that there was a lot of commonalities around the accounts, or the areas, or that were actually doing and generating the spam. Therefore, zooming in, building a rule very specifically for that problem, and that led to a vast decrease in number of cases, and therefore need for human for moderators, etc. So reducing the cost, but also much more effectiveness in actually detecting and removing the content. If you didn't track the right data, you wouldn't have had those insights. You wouldn't have been able to respond in that way. So again, there's so many different ways or data points to track, and I think the most important is, do you have the right info that will enable you to scale?
Thank you so much, everyone. And I saw a hand being raised. I think it was Elias. You can drop some questions in the chat, or we will have a Q&A. We will spend quite some time on Q&A, so do garner your questions, and do drop them in the chat in the meantime as well. I can also pick them up if they're relevant to that specific segment of the panel, and ask them during the panel. So don't hesitate to drop some questions in the chat. So round one, we discussed what we're tracking. What is it that we want to track? What's important to track? What is it that we're actually measuring? And I wanted to ask you, Aaron, and because I would love to hear this answer, is how well do your operational data priorities, right? So how well do these track with regulatory ones? So you're looking at, backlog of cases and incoming spike rates as your core kind of daily kind of obsessive, making sure that those numbers aren't hitting certain thresholds. Regulators are probably asking you, and I know they're asking you for different types of data, right? How well are you actually, removing certain types of content? To what extent you're addressing those risks? How well do these things track together? Are these requests or these kind of demands helpful? Are they creating friction? Are there any examples you can share to bring that to life?
So overall, I think the regulation generally starts from a place of good intent. And I should probably say that because I can be fairly pessimistic. The challenge is in the execution. Trust and safety, as I've said before, is focused on the right answer. So how can we make users safer continually with the tools and product we have available? The regulators, on the other hand, don't have access to the decisions you're making. They don't have access to your tooling, their data. So what they're continually trying to assess and ensure is that you've done the right homework to get to the right answer. And the two of them are very different. So already from a methodology approach, the things that I would do to initiate a sweep or to trigger a policy intervention may be based only on gut instinct for me. I go, oh, wow, this is a blank spot in our policy. I need to cover that. That's no longer sufficient in a regulatory environment, in that you need to show the trends. You need to document how this was escalated by moderators, how it got brought to your attention, et cetera, et cetera. Regulators are fixated particularly on certain harms, which would be great if they all agreed on what those harms were, but unfortunately they don't. So you get a mixed bag of requirements from each and every regulator. So for example, very small team, we have about 100 mods, 30 people in the company, and trying to mitigate the worst harms taking place on the site. Then Ofcom goes and releases their illegal harms requirement. I think the recommended reading was maybe 1,500 pages on that one. I don't know because I've never read it myself. But one of those, for example, as I got Tremo's advice on what do I need to do to figure this out, the problem with a lot of the regulation is I can't say, hey, I've been at this job for 2 years, and for the 2 years before that, so maybe 4 years in total, there's never been a single case that we have found on the side of human trafficking. Unfortunately, that's insufficient. The regulators are continually focused on if an absence of evidence is almost equivalent to deciding not to take action whatsoever. So instead, I'm left with this fixation on evidence, and I need to create an evidentiary basis in the app to ensure that I have zero data against that specific harm. Now, that was a long, drawn-out saying of how do I create zero data? Because I have zero data, but I do not have zero provable data. So instead, I have to go back and I have to re-architect the reporting criteria in the app. And we have to spend a while looking at all the different regulations going, hey, how should you be able to report human trafficking? And so that change should hopefully go through in the next week or two. But then you'll be able to report something. And then I will be able to collect that data to show the regulators over the next year or 2 years that we indeed have zero cases of human trafficking, except humans don't like filling out forms. So then you're going to have people who keep on clicking on human trafficking because they'll go under the theory that child safety and human trafficking will get reviewed faster than other queues. So I will still get a pile of tickets in that queue that I have created to please the regulator. And instead, then I have to show them the evidence that now all this noise in the queue is no longer valid. So here's how it becomes a molehill. where I've created an evidentiary queue that I then have to show evidence that there's no evidence in that queue, because you're still going to get a bunch of reports. So it's one of these things that in trying to meet the requirements of the regulator, you instead create far more noise for yourself to deal with than to clarify. But that's life these days.
That definitely was an example that brought it to life, including the kind of pain with it. I think you also touch on something which is really important, and I'd like to dig in a little bit more to this. And with Julie, maybe you can speak to this a little bit more. It's definitions of what do we mean, and what do we, so in companies are tracking their policies, right? And then regulators speak in legal terms, right? Like, what is illegal? How in this environment do we reconcile? How do these inconsistencies of what do we mean when we're speaking of these categories of harm? How do we reconcile these when we're trying to measure? And are there ways in which can we improve the reliability and comparability of all of this data that we're trying to measure?
Yeah, I think you forgot one category which is important, which is people and users on the platform who themselves may categorize differently. I think in looking today, for example, at the 17 OSA priority illegal content category, if you have something like harassment and coercive behavior and intimate image abuse, those are very distinct, listed as distinct categories, but they could be very similar in the types of harm seen on the platform. So again, reporting on each of those differently, and you may have platform policies or content policies that don't necessarily align with those, that don't align with your reporting, and that don't align with how people are going to report. For example, we know that users may be embarrassed by something they may have done if they're victims of sextortion, for example, and may report this as bullying, may report this as harassment, may report this as impersonation. So while the initial reason for reporting is something, the actual real harm is something else. And taking the time to unpack these and express the risk or the risk mitigation takes time and is a bit complicated. It's also difficult when you have people who may report multiple pieces of content for lots of different reasons, or the same piece of content for multiple reasons. How do you express those things? So yeah, again, regulators are very focused on legal definitions, and don't get me started on illegal versus harmful, which again complicates things a lot. Overall, I think we need to agree that platforms need to focus on reducing harm online and offline. That is going to meet a broad bucket, but that perhaps there needs to be some flex in understanding that the categories may not meet exactly. And this is where doing a mapping exercise between your internal policy, what the regulators say, and your own reporting may help. I don't know if I've lost you. Yes, I think I may have lost.
I think we got the gist of it. But maybe you need to check on that video.
I'm back.
Maybe video game is happening again on the background.
I'm gonna turn off on my video. Yes, I'm back.
But thank you so much, Julie. This is and yes, I mean, I think what Julie was saying in the last was that a mapping exercise which looks at, what are the regulatory categories, what are we measuring as a platform, and then making that understanding and reference across this is essential, ultimately, to really understand what is it which is behind these categories. And another difficult thing, which is what users report, isn't necessarily that category that you have in the drop-down menu is not necessarily the category that ultimately that report contains, right? Because users are messy and they think many things, and everyone has a different understanding of the words behind it. So reconciling this all in the back end and then reporting on it in harm and risk reduction is a big challenge. Louis Victor, maybe there's something that you can actually speak to this on how to potentially reconcile this challenge where platforms are juggling all of this. So how do you design this raw data flow and dashboard so it's useful, right? So when the incoming reports come in, how is it useful and how can it be useful to different personas across the team, right? So because that is also what we discussed before, how do we measure things and then we segment those measurements across the different personas that we have from TNS leaders or legal or policy or operations, right? They all have different needs.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Agna. To the first point of the question, I think it goes back to the flexibility in the tooling that you've implemented, right? How have you, because we've already seen some changes. For example, if you look at the Digital Services Act, right, between the first transparency reporting categorization that was still in draft, and then what came in later and was validated now, there still has been some categories and subcategories that have evolved, right? So it's how do you do that mapping? How flexible is that mapping? Because that mapping, maybe you've done it once for Europe, but then how do you do that for the UK, for Australia, for other regulations where the definitions, as Aaron and Julie said, aren't exactly the same, right? So if you don't have that ability to do in-house, it's going to be extremely, or to do very easily without engineering. It will require time and extra development to do. And then to your other point around how do you adapt? For sure, I mean, we see this across all our different clients, right? User reports are a lot of the time unreliable because even when they are justified, they're very often in the wrong category. And so therefore, it's how do you distinguish between what we call internally a label and the policy violation, right? The label is what it's come in, the policy violation, what it comes out. Very often it's not the same. And then it's how is your tool flexible enough to be able to distinguish between the two? But also those are very interesting data points as well, because we spoke about users and quote unquote normal users, but you also have a lot of different actors that are also sending reports. You have trusted flaggers now with the in Europe with the DSA. You also have law enforcement agencies from across. You also want to be able to track how accurate they are as well, and so being able to do the distinction between the two, being able to give an accuracy rate to in the same way you would do with a model, for example, is something that can bring value. To the second part of your question, Agna, around the different personas and who's looking at trust and safety data points. I mean, Aaron, you mentioned it before when you gave I'd say that the three data points that you'd be, or the three metrics you'd be looking at, right? You're looking to try and say, okay, on a day-to-day operations, how are my queues doing? How are my operations? Is there a spike? Is there something going wrong? How can I have the information to say, okay, there's something that's out of the ordinary, therefore I should probably investigate what's happening. If you're legal, right, you want to be able to look and say, okay, how many complaints or how many law enforcement requests did I receive, or how many subpoenas or whatever elements did I receive, and how can I track and what's the impact? If your policy, you probably want to be able to see, okay, what are the policy violation rates across this or this harm, or what are if I look at appeal rates, for example, or appeal overturns, what is that telling me in terms of the clarity of my policies, or the training of my moderators, or the accuracy of my models, right? And so it can tell you so many different things. And so depending who the persona is, then that information needs to be shown in the right way for that persona, but also giving that person the additional metadata or additional drill down ability to be able to understand and do the root cause analysis, which is so important to ultimately, as Julie and Aaron, you both said, do what we're here to do, which is keep the user safe on the platform.
Thank you so much for this. Very, very insightful. And I was trying to figure out how are we going to, we have one more round to go, and I was trying to figure out how I'm going to wrap this up, because there's a lot here that you've all said that I would love to quote already. So I'm really enjoying this. Thank you all. We have one more final round. We had track. What are we tracking? How are we tracking? What are we measuring? What is it that we're trying to measure, and for whom? And now, what are we reporting? So what is it that when we're trying to make it, when we're trying to make it and we're trying to report for a change, right? We're trying to report to the regulator, we're trying to report internally. And with that reporting, ultimately, what we're trying is to communicate something. We're trying to communicate in space and time how the platform is doing, and given to different personas, what is it that we're reporting and why. And also, I'm seeing questions coming in. We'll take these after this round. So do keep them coming. Aaron, what do you wish external stakeholders, regulators, civil society, or users understood better about the data if you're trying to share information with them? What do you wish they understood better?
When we were discussing this whole panel, it reminded me of an old job that I used to have where in Canada I worked on the open government team. And there we differentiated in between three different buckets. We differentiated in between data and then knowledge and insights. And I think regulators often make that error where they assume that you have all the data within your holding and you can use it to generate any type of knowledge and insights that they need at a moment's notice. And that's not true at all. Especially for a startup, we don't even have the data as a starting point. I look at, Virginia law, how many 14 to 16-year-olds, let's go with a rough estimate, are spending over an hour on your app. Well, that means that we need to track exactly how long someone's spending on the app, and we don't do that. So, they're looking for the insight level, and then they want other pieces to be connected. But the reality is, they're often thinking at the insight level, but there's a lot that has to happen. From sometimes an engineer has to do a manual data pull. There needs to be an analysis. Sometimes you have to create a system to measure that type of content, and then you have to move it to the level that the regulator wants, which is, X amount of teens are spending this much time on your app, and we don't have that in a bite-sized little notation. We don't even have the underlying data in the first place. And there's often this confusion at the regulatory level where it's like, why can't you generate the insights on demand when I need them? So to go into two specific examples, because I want to be fair in my pulling snark at various regulations. The first is the eSafety Commissioner recently made a comment when Julie there, not this Julie, was talking about age verification. And I don't know what the rationale, maybe they were getting a lot of heat over having to age verify everyone. So the comment was recently, hey, you don't actually need to age verify all your users. You can use all the data you collect on them for targeted advertising anyways, so that a bunch of your users are already over the age of majority. Great, you can skip that step and only focus on the rest. But what you've accidentally done is you've given, the largest organizations a free pass, the Metas of the world, et cetera. They get to use their derived data from targeted advertising, et cetera, to go, this person's over the age of 35. Us, on the other hand, because we're privacy oriented, because we don't collect any of that data, are left with having to age verify every single one of our users. So you accidentally, in this assumption model of everyone has the data, you've created a regulatory mode where it is easier for the largest organizations to comply and pass this, and much harder for the smaller players because we have to age verify everyone. And then a final example during the DSA, because I can't leave you alone, Agna. At least this only just recently got incorporated with the DSA, but previously it was part of the Disinfo Code. So regulators were very fixated on structural indicators, and they were advised by a number of very well-meaning NGOs. But they assume that we have all this information, knowledge, and insight at our fingertips and that we choose not to act. It's a very unfair assumption. So in these structural indicators, they had some very well-meaning ones where every month you are going to report the total number of disinformation pieces of content you have on your site divided by the total number of journalistic pieces of content. This is while I was at Twitter. And it's very naive and oblivious to believe that you even know either of those points. I don't know how many journalists are on the app, much less how many journalistic pieces. How many are comments by the journalist? How many are their actual articles? Okay, you can make an attribution and stuff like that, but that's still a ton of work. And that's just identifying the journalistic pieces of content on the site, or at least this is what I remember. But Disinfo, I mean, if we knew what the disinfo was on the site, that would be a solved problem. But we can tell you how many pieces of Russian disinfo have we found, and even then it's confusing. Do you go account by account? Do you go every single piece of content issued by the account? What happens if the piece of content is reposted by someone else who's naive and well-meaning? Does it become disinfo or is it misinfo when shared by someone else? So how you define the terminology really changes, but it's a lot of, I think this encapsulates very much that like insights versus data. I know how many pieces of content. I certainly have zero clue how many pieces of disinfo I have on a regular basis. So it's just a meaningless indicator of disinfo versus journalistic articles. And anyone who was trying to produce it also, again, is producing a meaningless indicator, but it gives you that fulfillment of like, yes, we're getting insight. We know who's working on it, when in reality it means nothing, especially when we consider the question of who's considered a journalist these days, which blends the lines in between both categories. But I'll stop there. Sorry, that was a long one.
No, I love these examples. They really do bring to light, I think, two key issues which you're mentioning, which is the importance of understanding of what is the diversity of platforms that actually exist and what are their limitations, other than just kind of taking the baseline off of maybe the few which make the most noise, and also the importance of understanding what is actually behind data points when someone is suggesting those. Like, I think the disinfo versus media seems a particularly stark example there, that you would have to go and count all the content on the platform to even have that information, right? So very, very interesting. Thank you for sharing these. Julie, I'd like to turn a little bit, what metrics do you think can shift, or have you seen shift internal priorities or help prove trust and safety value to executives, either internally or if you want to take an external viewpoint, externally to regulators or the wider public? Can you share some examples?
Yeah, I think before, the arrival of regulation that stipulates the type of data that needs to be shared, looking sideways at competition could also help shift some of the priorities within a company. So it only takes one company to start sharing data broken down by countries, or proactive rate of removal, or removal with 0 views. So really considering the reach for other platforms to follow suit and say, oh, crap, our biggest competitor is now sharing this. Now we're going to look, behind if we don't. And I think trust and safety teams should embrace this. Whether it is a competing platform sharing something, whether it is a bad press story, never let good crisis go to waste, to drive, change internally. And then again, to Aaron's point, going beyond the data point and try to extract the meaning. What does it really say about the state of your systems or processes internally? This is why I do like, even when platforms take the time to write, mini study, case study, white paper, just telling more of the story of what that meant, explaining how difficult it is and what they've learned, beyond just sharing a data point where you're like, okay, it's great, I've got a data point, but so what? So taking the time to look at extracting those insights. And I think it is as much as a pain for teams who are dealing with regulatory compliance and trust and safety team to do those risk assessments or get this data. It is also incredibly powerful to be able to say, hey, we do have incoming volume from this locale on this type of issue, and our proactive detection rate is low, and our appeals rate is bad. And what does it mean? And take the time to do the RCA. So I think TNS teams should be going towards their legal colleagues and try to see if they can get more of the data and understand more what it means to help build their business case to get their work prioritized.
Thank you. Thanks for this, Julie. And I think maybe this is also tying up well. So, Louis-Victor, when we're looking at this data, and we have more demands on the data, so there's more personas that are producing kind of reporting within different organizations. You have trust and safety, but you also have compliance, right? And this is being layered on top. And compliance reporting is often seen as a burden. But whether we like it or not, it's here to stay. We're not seeing any of these regulators kind of going away anywhere, and compliance reporting is here. So, and we are already seeing platforms kind of using it in different ways. What do you see? Can this become as kind of a catalyst? How can this best be used? And how can this also be used to kind of build trust? If it's here anyways, how can we make a benefit out of it?
Well, I think in the same way, in the same vein as Julie, you said, never let the crisis go to vain. I'd say never let the regulation be wasted. If you're working on trust and safety and a lot of the data points, sometimes we see some companies or some trust and safety teams, and maybe in the past, struggling to get some level of data, right? Trying to prioritize engineering work on building the right tools, the right infrastructure for them. Aaron, you were mentioning, and I love this data knowledge insights. We know how complex, anybody who's actually worked with databases, you know how complex it is to try, especially if you're building on legacy systems, you've been a platform that's there for several years, you've got data spread out across 20 different databases that don't speak to each other. You need to kind of do an entire mapping, and it's like excavation to try and understand what the data means, how you link it together. And it takes weeks to do. And as always, or as sometimes, trust and safety that's not the priority right now. So you're not going to get the engineering time. Compliance has enabled or can help trust and safety teams bring back that prioritization and saying, okay, we need investment in this, and this. We need to be able to track these data points. We need to be able to see, not just because we need it for day-to-day operations, which maybe hasn't been listened to, but because there's a regulator behind, and we really need them, right? And I always tell our clients to take advantage of this, to be able to use this as a leverage also to give better data to the trust and safety team, to enable them to do their job even better. Now, Aaron, you're right, not every single data point that the regulators ask is useful. Some is useful for regulators, not for platforms. But sometimes they are, and sometimes there are things that probably should be tracked, haven't been tracked, and it's a good way of being able to leverage them. Julie, you also mentioned something at the end, which I think is really interesting, and it's part of a work we've recently done, and we'll be speaking more about it in the coming days or weeks, where as platforms start doing more and more transparency, there's actually much more, and regulators are looking at this. How do you compare one platform versus another? And each platform is also looking at the other, saying, where am I in regard to this, regard to my. So we're about to publish a big study on, a cross analysis across the different VLOPs, because those are the platforms that have already published a transparency report, analyzing and comparing, and giving the dashboards to be able to do so, because we think that that's extremely valuable to understand also how different platforms, what risks they face, how they answer, what are some of the mitigation measures they can have in place, etc. So for sure, it gives a good compliance. I think compliance. I'm biased, of course, given my previous role, and given that my role in the French administration was to push for more transparency metrics. But because I fundamentally believe that that's also giving more tools, or can give more power to some of the trust and safety teams to build the right systems and to track the right data internally.
Thank you so much. This has been. I've loved this discussion. I have a whole notebook full of notes. Never let a crisis go to waste. It's like eating a piñata. This is all here. This is in block letter. I'm loving it. We have some time for questions. And one of the questions that we have already, and I encourage the audience to continue putting a few more down. One of them is that VLOPs will be increasingly using AI models and agents to track their performance and the behavior of their users. How do you see that impacting, if at all, DSA transparency reporting system and metrics? What needs to be changed or adapted? Julie, Is there anything you would like to comment on that?
I think in thinking about AI ahead of today's session, I just thought in the same way that platforms have started reporting on automated reports, what percentage of your incoming volumes are reviewed by ML, I think having the impact of AI represented here would be useful, which is it's no longer some automation rule, but this is a model that is, gauging whether something could be relative or not would be interesting, especially considering the impact it has on your team of FTEs and human, right? They have to report on the size of their team. There's this big investment in AI. How do both of these things remain true? I think it's a bit harder to gauge the impact on the platform and the impact on users in the same way that it's difficult to report on algorithmic change and measuring, in quantifiable number, what difference it made to individuals and users. So I think that there may be more time this, but I thought at least having as a first data point, user reports where AI was either proactively or reactively.
That's very helpful. We have another question that is on defamation and Article 16 illegal content reports. And maybe, Aaron, I'm not sure if you're getting a lot of defamation user reports, but defamation is a notoriously challenging one to handle. And Aaron, and also Julie, if you want to weigh on this. I think the question goes to that this really puts you kind of in a judgment role, and it's a hard one to handle without potentially infringing on kind of, or also one is from the user, from kind of a fundamental rights perspective, but from a platform perspective as well. You don't want to be losing users to kind of educating on these decisions either way, right? You don't want perpetrators to continue perpetrating, and you don't want other users, but you don't want to make wrong decisions on there, right? How do you handle defamation?
This was bringing up very quote unquote fond memories of.
Sorry
about that. I will not go into details in this case on the examples, but my goodness. So this has been quite the thorn in my side, in the entire time of being in trust and safety. And the answer is it depends. Is fundamentally the issue. My perspective is that defamation in most cases is something that is largely decided in a court of law, but that you have to balance to the best of your ability between a user's right to free expression and speak truth to power versus not allowing, completely toxic claims to overtake your app. So at least what I'm looking at, right now, we're still very unsophisticated. It's very leave up, take down, or add a label. But, maybe these are the kinds of things as we get more sophisticated, to other apps, you can look at demoting that type of content, etc. Certainly, I have seen, though, when you get into things like the Nigerian election, etc., comes to mind, you're recruiting a whole slew of influencers and just throwing anything at the wall, popular singer slept with politician's wife, prostitute, left with sexually transmitted disease. This was all one election that's coming to mind, but like just the range of different things that the opposite campaign was using influencers to sling within the debate. In fact, I just watched a video earlier today of fully AI generated campaign in the New York mayoral race generated by one of the campaigns, and full AI generated campaign video of criminals advocating for one of the candidates. And this is the future of politics, etc. So I'll still stick to the guidelines moving forward, which is that defamation is something that I do not want to touch, but it is something we definitely don't want to promote either. And that's probably the balance that I generally stick with overall.
Thank you, Aaron. Julie, do you want to add something to this? Okay.
That tells you how much I love defamation, but I don't want to add anything.
But I think one of the elements here is, and Aaron, I really enjoyed your answer, because one of the elements is also, it depends requires the flexibility and the tooling that enables you to put the independence in practice, right? And it also means that, potentially the it depends also means who's being targeted, right? Is it somebody in an election, in a presidential election race, or is it somebody in the local bar that's being, we all have the same rights, but at the same time, the repercussion of a takedown or of a non-takedown around this or that event are going to be completely different. So you need to be able to, going back to the data, but based on the metadata that you have potentially around one account that's being targeted, or that is publishing the content, then maybe the reaction you will need to take will be different, potentially. It depends.
I'm sorry, my first follow-up, but even an identical scenario can change from moment to moment. So for example, a frequent tactic I used to see at Twitter in the Middle East, if a female news journalist was breaking a controversial story against someone powerful, frequently I would see Photoshop content, and nowadays it would be nudify content, sexual content. They would conduct a full character assassination on the person in order to totally diminish the quality of the news coverage. So to put the news question in coverage. So that's an example, but Agna, I'll let you actually steer the conversation as opposed to me going off on tons of examples.
No, I love this. You should absolutely. Aaron, I love all of your examples. Your examples are very colorful and very impactful always. So don't ever hesitate to share one of your examples. We are running to the close of our evening here together. This has been a really cool hour. I've really enjoyed it. I hope our listeners have really enjoyed it. This is recorded, so we will be sending to anyone who didn't make it a recording of it, and those of you who absolutely want to listen to this again as well. And I really appreciate all of you coming here and sharing your insights with us. We discussed the importance of tracking and the importance of tracking the right data. And even if you have infinite resources, or if you don't have or if you have a lot of resources, or if you don't have a lot of resources, there's always key data points that can be figured out on what you need to track and what you can leverage. And it's important to figure out what those data points are and build from scratch. Measure. I think we discussed what is the most important thing is also aligning the definitions, figuring out what is it exactly that you're measuring, and making sure that it's clear across all of these categories. And then reporting. Reporting has to be done. It has to be done internally, has to be done externally. It's here to stay, reporting, but reporting is always an opportunity. So don't waste a good opportunity to report, either because it's a crisis or it's because it's a regulation, but don't waste a good opportunity. And I think what Aaron has pointed us all to was that a good case study is always going to be a very impactful way to report. So data alone doesn't give you much, but with a good set of examples and with a good insight analysis around it, a data point can really come to life. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for listening in. I really appreciate it. Hope everyone has a great night or a great rest of the day.
Thanks very much, Agna.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.